world dwells in darkness. The world is darkness.
All Hallows Eve, we're going to bring out some scary truths behind the Christian faith. Today marks 500 years since an angry monk exposed evil in our ranks.
One might say Luther was like the first celebrity.
I did nothing. The Word did everything.
October 31, 1517, the date Luther chose to post his 95 claims of protest to the Roman Catholic Church to the doors of Kassel Cathedral. Today, the effects of that revolutionary Reformation. I'm Lorna Dueck, and this is Context. Author, scholar, and Professor John Stackhouse will shake us up on how piety and the Reformation changed the church forever. Operation World, Jason Mandrake has some stunning statistics to show us about the global movement of faith. He will be joining us from London, England. Sheldon Neal visits the University of Toronto's Flickering of the Flame, an installation all about the Reformation and how the Gutenberg press changed everything. A man who understood that the printed word would become one of the most important instruments lighting the way into the modern era. Coming up on my snapshot, the first social media post by Martin Luther 500 years ago today. Well, we'll get a millennial point of view on that from Logan Gates. Martin Luther sparked one of the greatest religious reforms in history. 500 years to the day, his work and life still captures the hearts and minds of people everywhere. But why? Well, we sent Sheldon Neal to find out.
I'm at the University of Toronto, surrounded by old, really old stuff that shaped Christianity. Librarian P.J. Carefoot has collected 15th and 16th century European documents that let ideas about belief in God loose through the media of its day. It was a dangerous activity because it was the first time the authority of king and clergy were challenged on access to God. Why was there a Reformation?
I mean, part of it was because there were certain corruptions in the medieval church that had to be redressed. Among these were questions that had to do, for example, with indulgences. One of the things that Luther got most upset about was, how does one get to heaven? Is it by deeds or is it by faith? The medieval church had very much bought into the idea it's by deeds. And Luther is one of the first that comes along and says, no, we are saved not by anything that we do, but by faith.
What rediscovery of truths of the Christian faith did the Reformation bring?
Well, among them is the idea that we are saved by faith. Not by any actions that we do. It's not to say that Christian actions aren't important, they are, but it's the realization that Luther brings to the table that we are saved because of Christ, because of what Christ does. The actions that we perform, the deeds of Christian charity, they proceed from our faith in Christ, but there is no belief that simply by doing those deeds we save ourselves. So this is one of the things that Luther recovers. Also, the importance of Scripture, a return to the Gospels, a return to all of the Scriptures, was necessary for informing what the Christian life should look like. These were some of the insights that Luther and the other reformers, and also during the Catholic Reformation, came back to the idea that we have to recover this, perhaps the primitive truths of the early church.
Martin Luther took new media of their day, pamphlets, woodcuts, and circulated them through the social, highways of the time to promote a message that was really about religious reform. Talk about the role of early media through the printing press of that day being a key factor to the Reformation.
It wasn't the only factor, but it was probably one of the most essential because the printing press was invented in 1450. The Reformation is the first revolution that takes place after that moment. So as a result of the printing press, it meant that Luther had access to media, as you say, books, but not just books, pamphlets, broadsides, engravings, all sorts of ways to be able to communicate not only to those who could read, but also to those who were illiterate. So woodcuts, for example, cartoons, all of these things were things that Luther made use of. And he established his own brand, really, of communication as a result of it. A pamphlet, for example, could be printed pretty much overnight. And that meant that Luther's ideas that he may have preached on a Sunday morning were in the hands of ordinary people far, far away from Wittenberg within a day, 2 days, 3 days. And then people were copying them, probably illegally. They were violating what the equivalent of copyright was, pirating these editions, which meant that the word was getting spread even farther. So this new media did not exist 100 years before this. So when you had people like Wycliffe or Jan Hus who had attempted to reform the church in their own day, they had no access to multimedia. All they had was the written word with a pen, and of course that was a far more arduous task. With the printing press, you could get your message out quickly, efficiently, and economically.
Talk to me a little bit about media propaganda of that day through, again, pamphlets and woodcuts showing often very riveting and jaw-dropping images, again, pointing towards religious reform. Do we see a lot of that riveting imagery showing up in today's society for the purposes of reform today?
Absolutely. Luther is the first person that really understands the value of political cartooning. So he will take subjects that to many people, quite rightly, are offensive today. Depictions of the papacy that would be offensive to us today were equally offensive in the early 1520s, 1530s. He manipulated these images to be able to say to people without words, this is what has happened to the church. That is the beginning of political cartooning. You can trace the line right from what Luther did in 1545 right through to things like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons that brought about the deaths of the cartoonists in Paris. It is all part of the same strain of communication, but Luther's the one that establishes it. And he realized that images speak. When a person cannot read text, you can interpret an image. So it was part of Luther's brilliance to be able to manipulate this kind of media.
Luther was an original thinker and used vile and somewhat ugly speech, bordering on hate speech, to really attract people to his cause, to his purpose. I'm wondering, is it because of his documentation, the way he presented his message, why his message is still known 500 years later?
It took a lot of courage to be able to stand up both in person and in print against the powers of the day. And he did. He stood up against the power of the church. He called for its reformation. And I think that resonates with people still to the present day, to see someone who is the underdog who stands up against authority. And I think that resonates with many of us still to this century.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Reformation, 500 years after the most disruptive event in Christianity. Well, Christianity remains the largest religion in the world. Nearly a third of our Earth's population identify as Christian. This term includes both Protestants and Catholics. And when you divide up these two groups, about 37% of Christians call themselves Protestants, 50% say they are Catholics. And while the Reformation was birthed in Europe, that is not where Protestant Christianity is actually growing. 2010 data from the Pew Research Center says nearly 9 in 10, 87% of the world's Protestants live outside of Europe. And these are developing countries that belong to the global south. The continent bursting at the seams for the gospel, Africa. In 1900, Africa was home to 8.7 million Christians. Today, there are 542 million. Despite a communist government, revolution in China is happening with the gospel spreading. 100 million Christians and counting. Perhaps the most symbolic representation of church growth is in South Korea, where the largest Pentecostal church on the planet has under 1 million members. But Latin America, traditionally Catholic, now has a third of the population in 4 of 18 countries, just a few of the areas that the gospel is spreading like wildfire. So let's bring in Jason Mandrake from Operation World into the conversation. He travels the globe and reports on the global changes in the church. Jason, thanks for being there in London, and we've just heard of the changes of regions like Latin America. What countries should we keep an eye on when we think about global growth in the church?
I'd say as a continent, the place where we need to keep an eye on is Africa. This is partly because the fastest population growth is occurring in Africa as a continent. And Christians, of course, also have babies, so the Christian population is growing quickly there. But in Africa, we see the church also growing not just by reproduction, but by evangelism. And so we're expecting that a very significant portion of all future growth in the Protestant and evangelical church is going to be on the continent of Africa. Obviously, places like Nigeria and Ethiopia, which already have large populations, are going to be places where that growth is particularly pronounced.
Okay, now you also say Islam is going through a time of reformation similar to that of Christian Europe 500 years ago. What are you seeing?
Well, I'd say that we see it much more clearly now because of the era we're in, technologically speaking, the information age. But Islam is around the same age now as what Christianity was when it underwent the Protestant Reformation. And we're seeing a lot of upheaval in the Muslim world. And while I would never claim to be an expert on Islam, we see both the issue of fundamentalism, which has reared its head in Islam, but we also see many other influences, globalization, and a more moderate and tolerant and even liberal version of Islam that has emerged, at least in part, due to its interaction with the rest of the world and the secular West in particular. And so, of course, Islam is not some monolith. There are many, many different articulations and expressions of it. But we see a season, particularly in the Middle East and the Gulf area, of significant upheaval and change within Islam on the ground and within Islam theologically and intellectually as well.
All right, Jason Mandrake, a global and multi-faith perspective there on the need for reformation. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
That was Jason Mandrake of Operation World in London, England. Well, Context has a great blogger who provokes us to thought every week on our website and at Twitter. You can read him there. Dr. John Stackhouse, the professor of religious studies at Crandall University, joins us now. Here's another secret about you, John. You are a Reformation specialist. So thank you for teaching with us. Give us your description of what was so worth protesting in 1517 that we're still letting it shape us today.
Well, I think that as complex as the Reformation was, Lorna, at its heart was a very basic and personal question. Martin Luther and so many others really wanted to know, is God on my side? Is God, as Luther said, pro me? Is he for me? Or do I have to exhaust myself trying to do the best I can and hope that God will take me in? That's really the question at the heart of the Reformation.
But why did it have to spill out then in so much bloodshed, so much division? I mean, it's quite a murderous rampage when it begins.
Well, it begins actually as a conversation among religious experts, but it also then gets caught up, as religion often does, in other things that are waiting to go boom. And that would be national politics and imperial politics and papal politics. And they're playing for very, very high stakes. So yes, there's eventually going to be war and bloodshed. But the Reformation really isn't about that. And the wars really aren't about religion, despite their name. The Reformation is fundamentally a question of how do I relate to God? How does God relate to me? And how can I get a good God? And that's a question, of course, that we ask today.
So let's talk about how that then becomes translated through Protestantism. Explain that whole development that begins, that so many of us find ourselves in that basket.
Well, Protestantism is just a category for Western Christianity that isn't Catholic. And as the European nations spread around the world in their colonial and trade routes, they bring Protestant missionaries with them. They bring Protestant civilization with them, as happens in the Catholic side of things as well. And Protestantism has this wonderful entrepreneurialism and this terrible fractiousness. And the combination means that we like to start new things, but we also are fairly impatient if people don't get along with us and we split off and do our own thing. So that's why we have 40,000 denominations. And we also have all these special purpose groups, from World Vision and Compassion and these various charitable groups to a Christian Motorcyclists Association. We like to start things, and we like to do our own thing.
The protesters. It also affected the Roman Catholic Church, though, and we just heard from an earlier interview how the church is growing around the world. Do you think in North America it's time for another Reformation hunger?
Well, I think we do have to have a hunger. It's an interesting word you pick there because I'm not sure how hungry we are, but I'm not sure that means that we're satisfied. It may mean that we're sick and our appetite is depressed because we're actually in pretty bad shape. My sense is that as I look at the North American church, there are many signs of confusion, of lassitude, of a kind of laziness, a kind of selling out to non-Christian agendas and forces. And so my sense of the Reformation here is not the question, does God love me? But the question is, do I love God? Do we really show any signs of being serious about our Christianity? That's the question today.
Okay, so we are not as serious a seeker as they were in those years, 500 years ago for the Reformation. Our piety is flat. Give me a few examples of where you go, this is an alarm bell that needs a reformation in the church.
Well, church attendance continues to decline. Our giving is very low. The average good giver in Canada might give $1,000 a head, which isn't going to fund what needs to be funded. Christians don't get together very often with other Christians and talk about Christianity and talk about their faith. We just talk like everybody else. In fact, there are very few signs that Christians live very differently than their moral and admirable neighbors. And in some ways that's good, but in some ways it's not good because it means that there's nothing distinctly Christian in these Christians' lives. And so there'll be nothing to hold up against the forces of consumer capitalism and the state and these other forces that want to reduce us all to just being consumers and producers. And Christianity says life is about more than that.
All right, Dr. John Stackhouse, that is a good challenge to us working on the Reformation once again in our own hearts and minds. Thank you. Check out Dr. Stackhouse's blogging on the Context website. He helps us think deeper every week. Thanks for joining us there on the lecture circuit in Manitoba at Providence College. Still ahead, how will Pope Francis mark the Reformation? Our Context special correspondent Sheridan Sanders reports from Rome. Coming up on my snapshot, a millennial look at the impact of Martin Luther on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. That's with Logan Gates, next on Context.
The scene here in Puerto Rico is apocalyptic. Coming up next week on Context, stories of the economic impact and survivors of Hurricane Maria. Some haven't seen help for over a month, others are sick from lack of food. I'm Cheryl Weber. I'll bring a report on the ground from Puerto Rico.
The time for silence is over. The time to speak has come.
That from the PBS documentary Martin Luther, the idea that changed the world. That idea that priests and popes were not necessary for God's forgiveness. Joining me now from Rome is Context contributor Sheridan Sanders. Hello, Sheridan.
Hello, Lorna.
All right, tell us how the Roman Catholic Church is commemorating this 500th anniversary of the great schism of belief in Christianity.
Well, the year actually began last year on the 499th anniversary when Pope Francis went to Lund, Sweden, to celebrate with the church there. And in an ecumenical sort of service, they spoke about how they could move forward together in shared witness. So that's how the year started. And of course, throughout the year, Pope Francis has met with several different delegations from many different denominations to celebrate, not to celebrate, but to commemorate the anniversary.
Because there was a counter-reformation as well. As Protestants, these protesters were splitting out all over and, repudiating the doctrine of forgiveness through the papal system. Your church family, the Roman Catholic, did its own counter-reformation. Explain that a little bit, what started to birth in your tribe.
Well, it was very critical moment, and in fact, in some ways, very good in that it was an opportunity to reflect and some of the best saints have come out of this time period. We see Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who founded the Jesuits, a major religious order that has impacted the world, and then of course you have Saint Teresa of Avila, who with her mystical writings inspired many, and then we have the Council of Trent, which it's actually a brilliant council, this council, because it responds to and corrects a lot of the issues that we see that sort of formed or at least inspired some of the grievances that caused the Reformation. So it was a great opportunity for reform and to get back to the essentials.
All right, and Sheridan, what's so fascinating to myself as a Protestant with our 40,000 different splits of how we're all going to work out our belief in God, your church has been able to keep the magisterium. Explain how you keep the corrective ongoing and yet all still stay locked in step.
Yeah, there's an amazing paradox that gets created when you have the magisterium. You're able to freely discuss and to vigorously engage in these big questions, but at the same time, you're able to create uniformity. So the magisterium is sort of the last word on everything. It's what we as Catholics, as we profess, we believe these tenets. So it's kind of like the guiding way, but within that, Catholics don't always. There's a lot of diversity in opinions and perspectives and emphasis, and that creates a lot of back and forth between people. And as much as there's diversity in the Protestant denominations, there's also a huge diversity in the Catholic sphere as well.
And some would wonder if Pope Francis is agitating for another Reformation within your ranks. He is pushing at the boundaries, is he not?
Yes, no, he definitely calls us to, he's very faithful, actually. I mean, people can interpret him as being sort of like pushing the boundaries. But I think that's what our faith calls us to be, is always to be out there. And he uses this phrase, get messy and, be out in the streets. You can't just be inside the sacristy, speaking to your own all the time. So I think it's a wonderful tension that exists in Catholicism, where you've got Peter, who sort of remains the same, and then that impulse of Paul to go out there and to evangelize and to meet people and to pull them in.
Your church community is also growing. Globally, you've had explosions. Tell us a little bit about how and why the Catholic Church is growing.
I think what's beautiful about the church and what really inspires a lot of its growth is that, and especially I would say in the third world, South America, is that we see that the faith enculturates itself. So it takes what is good and beautiful in every human culture, and it weaves it together with the revelation that we see coming through the church and through the tradition. So the church is different in different parts of the world. I mean, I was in Uganda last year, and it's a beautiful, vibrant expression that is different from what I've experienced at home, for example, in Canada, or even in Rome or other parts of the world, but it's still Catholic. And I think that that's part of the reason why it is so successful. The other part is that there's strong identification with the poor. I think that is always something, and of course, anytime there is persecution, the church always grows in those circumstances, bearing witness.
Well, one of the strongest statements we saw on the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, that pulled apart Protestant and Catholic, was to see Cardinal Dolan together at one of New York's most historic Presbyterian churches. And Cardinal Dolan said, we may not agree, we weren't called to agree, but we were called to love each other. And I think, Sheridan, can you just close with giving your assessment? How is love between the two different types of Christian thought, Catholic and Protestant?
Yeah, so I think, at the end of the day, the fruits of the Holy Spirit is greater communion. And ultimately, that's what we're called to, is to celebrate and to love God deeper. And in loving God, we find each other. We find ways to create communion. So I think that in each of our faithful response to our traditions, those networks, the Holy Spirit is not limited by our structures. And I think that those networks, those communions, that bondedness will happen naturally as long as we're filled with humility and progressing towards the truth as it's revealed to us.
Sheridan Sanders, our correspondent in Rome, what a wonderful reflection on this, the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Thank you.
You're welcome.
On my snapshot, Logan Gates and a millennial point of view on the Reformation.
Next week on Context, how climate change is affecting our entire planet. We'll hear from world-renowned climate scientist Catherine Heo and award-winning science journalist Alana Mitchell about the global ocean crisis. That's coming up next Tuesday on Yes TV and Sunday on Global.
To my snapshot now. So let's hear from the millennial perspective on the Reformation's importance. Here's Logan Gates of Ravi Zacharias Ministries, one of our partners, helping us think on context.
I think the Reformation could be summed up as the rediscovery of the gospel, that is, of the core message at the heart of Jesus' teaching and at the heart of the Christian faith. And often it's summarized in terms of three solas, that is, three statements involving this Latin word sola, which means only. And the first of those is sola scriptura. The Reformation had at its heart this idea that we need to go back to the sources, to the original documents, to know really what the Christian faith was all about. And from that rediscovery of the Bible and its translation into English and widespread distribution, people then began to realize the second sola, which had this emphasis on grace, sola gratia, that actually the way that we become right with God, that we become close to Him and experience His love is not through a series of rituals that we do or prayers that we pray. It's actually purely an act of grace. Grace is something that you don't deserve. And what that means is that we receive God's love in this relationship as a gift that we don't deserve through what Christ has done on the cross on our behalf. And that grace we have access to through this last sola, which is sola fide, this idea of faith only. That it's only through just trusting in the sufficiency of what Christ has done on our behalf that we can now step into this relationship of grace with God that has the power to fill our lives the meaning and a purpose and a joy and a passion and a power that we could never have otherwise. So the Reformation was about this rediscovery of these ancient Christian truths, and I think it can be put in terms of those three things: Scripture, grace, and faith.
All right, so you don't really know where you've come from until you look back at the history, and that's what this 500th anniversary reflection on the Reformation was all about. Do we still remember it is our own individual responsibility to approach God personally for our forgiveness, for an infusion of His salvation and His love? Lots more on our website. Send us your thoughts on 500 years after the Reformation. You can read about my article there at the Globe and Mail as well. And lots of good learning to do for all of us. Thanks for watching Context. I'm Lorna Dewey.